Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Institute for Advanced Studies Distinguished Lecture Series. We are really thankful that so many of you have taken the time to visit UST's beautiful campus. Many of you are on this campus already, so perhaps not that new for you. My name is Tobias Zun, and I'm an assistant professor here at UST of pre-modern Chinese literature. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome and introduce our distinguished guest today. It's Professor Michael PUETTE, Walter C. Klein, Professor of Chinese History and Anthropology at Harvard University. I would say arguably the most prominent scholar of early Chinese religions, thought, and anthropology in the Western Hemisphere. Professor PUETTE hardly needs an introduction for anyone interested in the study of early China. What I will do is I give you a tiny bit of a different introduction here of him today, rather than just telling you what kind of things he has done in his 40-page CV or something like that, right? Unlike many of our colleagues in the field who studied sinology or Chinese studies, early China is largely a philological field today. He received actually his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago, a distinguishing mark in his biography that I think crystallized in his voluminous yet diverse academic output. And I want to emphasize a tiny bit what I think is special about his academic work in the rest of my little introduction. So if someone would ask me how I would describe Professor PUETTE's work, I would probably say that, like some of the great intellectuals of the late 19th century, he dares to think big. And he does so by using early Chinese materials, which is in some sense, at least with some of these early intellectuals from the 19th century, a distinguishing thing for them. And more importantly, I think thinking big is not really a strength of the field of early China, in my opinion. He really does something that goes against what I would perhaps say the MO, the modus operandi of philology in this case. He uses philology, but he doesn't follow the thoughts or the kind of frameworks, in some sense, that philology teaches us in academic training. But he does not only think, I would say, about the big topics such as innovation. That was his first book, The Ambivalence of Creation, where he basically questioned the Western claim, in some sense, that China only copies and repeats. They have no artifice, no creativity, and no innovation. And that was really a discourse that was popular in the 50s, 60s, 70s in China, in scholarship on early China. Then in the second book that he published, he basically addressed the question of, can human beings become divine beings, right? Something where also people in early China, in the field of early China, had some kind of problems with the idea, right, that humans could be treated like gods and could become gods. And that's also then the title of his book, To Become a God. And in the third one that I just picked out, because it's related to the workshop that I'm organizing right now, that will happen on the weekend, he cared about the topic of ritual in his book, and ritual and its consequences. And today, he talks about another big topic, technologies of knowledge. I won't say much about the title of it. He has plenty to say in a few minutes. But what I think is important, he doesn't just tackle these big topics. He tackles these big topics oftentimes to critically engage with truisms and I would say widely believed assumptions that impact the study of early China. What I just told you, right? Particularly the first one where he talks about creativity and how there were debates about creativity and non-creativity in early China, rather than just like some sort of Chinese spirit, right, or some kind of Chinese essence or attitude at these times. So not surprisingly, his scholarly excellence, and this is just a few books, there's a lot more out there, particularly also articles. This scholarly excellence is widely recognized and resulted in the bestowal of various awards, and I also keep it's short here to just two. The first one I want to mention is that he's a foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Science. And the second one I want to mention is he's a senior fellow at the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell University. And the second one I mentioned because he shows you, right, that Michael PUETTE is known and famous for his concern with how do we engage with things, how do we engage with theory and methodology. And this is really not typical for a scholar of early China. The last thing I want to mention today, and this goes a bit away from his direct scholarly output, is the impact that he had on the field of early China, particularly in his training of graduate students who many of whom have received good jobs in academia and are basically still pushing the boundaries of the field. The one that I want to particularly mention is somebody who was not his student and who just knew him from, I think the first time I met you in Hawaii. I want to emphasize how Michael Puett is a staunch supporter, or a very strong supporter, of younger scholars in general. And one of the examples that I want to mention briefly is, and this is something I really admire of him as a scholar, that despite being at a really reputatious position and institution, Michael always supported everybody that I know of who interacted with him without discerning where you're from, what you're doing. And this is something I think for any professor to keep in mind. There was a brief situation when I was a grad student where I ran into a senior colleague who basically destroyed, I think unreasonably, a project that I was working on. And I was really unsettled because I didn't know what to do. And Michael was in Wisconsin for a conference on the translations of the Shi. And he took 2 hours basically to meet with me in a coffee shop and talk with me about my project and how I'm doing, all these kind of things. And in his unique way of interaction and talking, he basically, what I would say, helped me dig my way out of these doubts and holes that I had. Because if you're a young student, it's quite unsettling if a senior faculty tells you what you're doing is just wrong, and basically helped me finish this project. And so for me personally, I think this is perhaps beyond your intellectual things, one of the most amazing things about you as a professor and as an intellectual. To summarize this, as you can see, I'm incredibly thankful for him, and also more importantly that he actually took his time, despite his busy calendar, right? And to fly here, he jumped on the plane yesterday and arrived this morning. So this is really like quite some commitment to this talk today and to the workshop that is happening on a weekend. So I would like you to help me welcome him and to join me in welcoming Professor Puett to present his talk here today on constructing worlds, technologies of knowledge in classical Chinese social and political theory.
Thank you so much, Tobias, for the much, much too nice introduction, but very deeply appreciated. Thank you. And what you said about me is absolutely true about you. You were an extraordinary scholar and a truly extraordinary mentor as well. I've heard from many, many, many people. So thank you, and thanks to the Institute for Advanced Study for inviting me here. It is such an honor to be here. So this talk comes out of, as Tobias mentioned, a larger project I've been engaged in, trying to think through what it would mean if we took classical Chinese social and political theory seriously as theory. By social and political, I mean I include very much theories of religion, theories of ritual, theories of belief, all of the theories that arose in classical China, I want to say are theories. I think we should be reading them, not just to understand China, although of course that will be invaluable, but because we should be thinking about them theoretically, period. It does not strike us as odd at all that we will, and we should, read 19th and 20th century and now 21st century European and American intellectuals as theorists to help us understand the world. We take that for granted. It seems very odd to say we should be doing the same thing for theorists from classical China. My argument is that should not seem odd. I would like a future world where people who are learning theory will be reading these texts from classical China, not simply to learn about China, but again, that's wonderful, but because they are a great theory. That people in economics will be reading Han Feize, to mention a name I'll be getting to later, just as well as they would be reading Milton Friedman and Keynes. To me, this is the kind of world we should be living in, and my goal today is to do a little bit toward making that argument. So to do so, let me begin with actually the name I just mentioned, Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, as you know, is one of the single most influential economists of the past several decades. He's really the architect of the mode of thinking that we now put under the general label of neoliberalism. And he, because of that influence, has become very controversial. I will be touching on a bit of that momentarily, but what I want to begin with is Milton Friedman's mode of argumentation, which is not as well understood in part because it's so taken for granted. It's so much a part of the way we tend to do theory that this is a part of him that we kind of look past. So I would like to go back to the 1950s, when Milton Friedman was first laying out his arguments, when he was certainly not an influential figure, was seen as this kind of odd, very right-wing figure, very much on the margins. And he was developing his theory of what he called positive economics. And what he meant by that was, unlike normative claims, which he very critically thought people like Keynes were falling into. In other words, Keynes, according to Milton Friedman, had a vision of a just society, and he was laying out his view of what such a just society would look like. And according to Friedman, he was allowing that normative vision to color the way he was developing his models. And Friedman, on the contrary, wanted to argue we should be doing economics the same way natural scientists study the empirical world. And they study the empirical world not by looking at it in all of its messiness, because out of the messiness you can't derive clear laws. The way you do it is you develop simulations. You have experiments in which you push aside all of the kind of messiness of the world. You try to isolate the limited set of phenomena you're looking at. You try to understand the laws that are governing that limited set of phenomena. And from that, you can generalize principles that will ultimately allow one to understand the rest of nature, but you begin with a simulation. And Friedman's argument was, this is what we need to do with human behavior too. And positive economics would be an attempt to find out, discover, would be a verb I think he would even prefer, what it is that makes humans tick in terms of economic behavior. And once we can figure that out, just as we would be figuring out laws that govern natural phenomena, the interaction of natural phenomena, once we figure that out, we could finally develop proper social policy based upon what really matters to humans and what makes humans operate, what motivates us to behave. And so he developed what he would call as-if models. And in his opinion, an as-if model was a simulation. And so he would do the following. He would say, if we look at economic behavior, it seems too complicated, right? You have all of these things going on. You have all of these complex regulations and humans with all of their complex motivations working in various hierarchical power structures. So how do you really isolate what's going on? And you do it through as-if models in which you take out a key set of individuals and you put them in a perfect simulation, taking away all of the things I just mentioned and isolating the simple sets of decisions that those sets of individuals would be making in an economic marketplace. And when you do this, if you note that the behavior they would do in this as-if simulation leads to the best possible sets of decisions, you can, number one, analyze what humans do at their best when they're making decisions. You can also analyze why they sometimes fail to do so. In other words, what of the messiness is preventing humans from doing what they normatively ought to be doing? But he would say ought is simply here, not his normative criteria, the ought being if they were doing what they really would do, if they could simply be isolated from the things that get in the way of what they really care about. His argument, and this next part is fairly famous, was to say, if you do this, you will note that what makes humans tick is a rational concern for self-interest, and in these simulations, if you work out what would be the most logically, rationally, self-interested actions of all of the individuals involved, it consistently, he argued, leads to the best possible outcome. And Moreover, if you then look at the empirical messy world at something that closely approximates that simulation, if it turns out that things worked out well in the messy world, exactly along the lines you find in your simulation, that shows the simulation is showing what they really cared about and what motivated their behavior. And when, on the contrary, you know places where in the messy world they did not actually act according to these principles and things did not go well, you can then ask, what is it that got in the way? And it will very consistently for Friedman turn out to be things like external regulations that create false incentive structures that prevented the individuals from acting according to their rational self-interest, and that's what skewed the messy world in terms of the development of an improper, poor trajectory. In other words, the argument is the simulation shows you humans at their best, which for him means best not normatively. Best means if you can wipe away everything that gets in the way of us making the decisions that we otherwise would be making, minus all of the things that prevent us from doing so. Consistently, as I've noted, that means for Milton Friedman, we are rational self-interests acting purely out of our self-interest, and in the simulations where everything else is taken away, that is consistently what, according to him, we will do. This is the basis, of course, of his entire economic theory, because once he can lay this out, he can argue, therefore, what we need to do in terms of economic policy is get rid of everything that was then completely dominant in American and European economic philosophy, which all came from Keynes. The vision was you absolutely must use government regulation and government redistribution to create a proper functioning of the economic world, because simply self-interested individuals will lead to often the worst possible outcome. Friedman's argument is that is precisely wrong. The worst possible outcomes precisely comes from the regulations that governments were actively pursuing. Therefore, what we must do, following this simulation, is make reality as much as possible look like these simulations. In other words, take away government regulations, take away governmental redistributions, take away the things the government is doing that's skewing incentives among rational individuals, and as much as possible create a market that would look like the simulation that he is laying out. In other words, the simulation, according to his analogy, gives you what a natural scientist would give you. What are the laws governing the interaction of natural phenomena? Once we've seen that humans can operate according to some very basic calculus, then our goal is to make our economic policy create a world like the simulation. Now, Milton Friedman, of course, is making this argument to, as we have seen, push against Keynes, to make an argument for a free market liberal economy. He was, as we know, incredibly successful. However, note the mode in which he is acting is actually a very typical and characteristic one, including among many people that he strongly disagreed with. In fact, if you do a genealogy of that approach to studying human behavior, you can trace it back, well, quite far, but the most important antecedents are really the 17th century in Europe, where you get theorists developing what are called state of nature arguments that basically function identically to Friedman as-if arguments. The whole argument of a state of nature is, well, if you look at the world, it's too messy. People have all of they're born into these complex customs and live in all these complex hierarchies that make it very difficult to see what humans really care about. So we'll put them in a simulation, the state of nature, which isn't an historical claim. It's to say, let's wipe out all of the customs, the histories, the complexities of the world, put people in this world of a simulation in which all that exists are a limited number of individuals, a limited number of resources, and in that world, what would they do? And of course, the characteristic argument is, in that world, they endlessly battle amongst themselves for these limited resources. They then, these individual agents, choose to create some overarching form of governance to prevent them from killing each other all the time. And then the state of nature arguments are all about what would individuals pushed outside of the messy world choose as a legitimate form of governance. In other words, how many of their own individual rights would they be willing to give up in order to maintain peace? And therefore, you get all of the debates developing that will later come to be what we know of as contractual theory, later developing into democratic theory, all about the legitimacy of forms of governance based upon these state of nature arguments. And the list goes on. If you look at people who Milton Friedman would hate from a political standpoint, many of them make the same sorts of arguments. So later, John Rawls will make a critique of Milton Friedman, and yet he'll do a very similar move. His key argument is to say, let's imagine humans born into a veil of ignorance. They do not know the world they will be born into. What would be for them a just society? In other words, it's a state of nature argument, basically, in which you take them away, you take them outside of the messy world they live in, say, what would they, as simple individuals, rationally choose as a just world? And then Rawls' argument is, that's the world we should create. Of course, it's the opposite of the ones Friedman was arguing for, but note, it's basically the same move. Ethical theory, for much of the analytic tradition, operates in the same way. So a standard way of talking about ethical theory will involve creating these simulated experiments in which humans are explicitly pulled out of the world they live in and are given this incredibly delimited circumstance with a single decision. And the question is, how will they make an ethical decision in that delimited simulated environment? So a typical example. There's a life raft, and you're in the middle of the ocean. You're on this life raft because your ocean liner has sunk. There are 4 of you on that life raft. There's enough food for 3 people. What do you do? And of course, the ethical debates are, do you toss someone off so 3 of you can live? And if so, who gets tossed off? Or do you choose not to toss someone off because it's simply unethical to kill someone? Or do you simply say, or if it's that, do we just all eat the 3 food until we all potentially die, but that's better than killing someone? Or do you agree that we will just come up with some kind of governance principles amongst the 4 of us that allow us to somehow vote on what the decision should be? So you sort of do a contractual argument. Note, however, regardless of the answer, the move is consistent to what we have seen. You create this simulated environment, individuals taken out of the complexities of life, given a single decision, and how do they best come up with a rational decision to adjudicate that? For all of these arguments, very much including Friedman, the claim is, if we can do this, we can understand what it is that makes humans tick at their best, because you're removing everything that gets in the way. And once you figure that out, be that rational self-interest, be that a desire for maintaining one's own property, except giving some of it away to a sovereign who can maintain peace, whatever it is, but the argument is these moves, what Friedman will call an as-if, what 17th century thinkers would call a state of nature, what a Rawls would call a veil of ignorance. The consistent move is find a simulation in which you can figure out what is truly the motivation for human behavior. And then once you figure that out, you can develop your entire ethical, social, economic, political theories according to that principle of what makes humans tick, and normatively, therefore, what the world should look like. The implication being, of course, we have not built a world that really, really properly focuses on what makes humans tick, and that is what social policy should be aimed at doing. Now, if this is a very typical move in the Euro-American ethical tradition, ethical, economic, social, political, so theoretical tradition in general, Is this unique to the West? The answer is absolutely no. You can see moves like this throughout all of global theory. Let me, finally, give you an example from classical China. So I would argue the Mohists do something very similar to this. So what's up? Going very quickly, the view is we live in this world in which all of these customs have slowly come to play a role in how we live our lives. It's led to this absolutely horrible world. What we need to do is derive the proper principles of what makes humans tick. Those proper principles should govern what it is that actually matters in the world, and we should therefore create a world accordingly. And, as you know, his move in essence is to give what we would call a basic utilitarian principle that will say everything should be understood according to a cost-benefit analysis. This should be the basis of all of our decision-making. And how do we create a world that will actually encourage that kind of behavior, that proper behavior, in other words, that proper way of understanding the world? We need to see that basically what makes humans tick is humans like benefits, and they don't like to not be benefited, which means if you can create a social policy where if they behave properly according to these principles, they will be rewarded. If you create, and they will of course be punished if they do not, if you can create such a world, you will finally create a world where humans will be encouraged to live up to themselves at their best. That will create a just world. In Woods' argument, that just world is, in fact, the vision of a divine power called heaven. This is the way heaven operates. Heaven runs the entire cosmos this way. We humans will live properly within heaven's vision if we act this way, and the way we can understand how to act this way is simply by doing the equivalent of this simulation to see what makes humans tick. Now, if this is a very characteristic move throughout global philosophy, and it absolutely is, an opening question, of course, is why? Part of that answer we've already begun to see. The why is to say the problem with the world is too many other things have developed in our culture, in our history, that have gotten in the way of building a proper order according to what makes humans tick. But note, that why shows the key assumption that I think underlies this entire move, that the way to do theory is to isolate what it is that really motivates human behavior. If you can isolate that, what motivates human behavior, what forms of reasoning define us at our best, if you can isolate that and build your world around that, you will finally build a proper world, and the way you get to that is through some kind of a simulation to wipe out history, wipe out culture, wipe out the complexities of the world to figure it out. Now, if this has been a characteristic move, let me now turn to some critiques of this. And I will argue, and given what I study, you won't be surprised to hear this, that classical Chinese thinkers have developed some of what I would consider to be among the most powerful critiques of this position. And not just critiques, but incredibly powerful alternate ways of doing theory. Not just in terms of the normative claims, which, as we've seen, can be all over the place even with the models we've been giving, but visions about what it even means to do theory and why you would do theory. To begin, let me just give one example of a critique of Mozi that is telling, and then I will use that to launch into a very different mode of critique that will emerge in the classical Chinese tradition. So in the opening dialogue of the Mencius, which is, as many of you know, a text probably written in the 4th century BCE, coming after Mozi, and by a thinker, Mencius, who hated Mozi. In the opening dialogue, Mencius goes to a king, and the king has clearly heard some ideas about Mozi, from Mozi, and argues, well, maybe I should build my realm based upon these principles of benefit and interest. And if I create an entire world that's based upon people's desire for benefit, I will create an orderly world. And Mencius's critique is very interesting. He does not argue what you might expect in a critique along the lines of what we've been discussing, which is to say, oh, no, Your Majesty, interest isn't really the motivation of humans. What really is the motivation is X, Y, or Z, and then some kind of an equivalent of a simulation argument. The critique actually is the exact opposite. He says, oh, yeah, you can do that. You can create a world in which everything is based upon interest, everything is based upon people being rewarded for doing what they then come to think of as in their best interest, punished for what is not. You will create an entire world where people will actually come to think this way. So he thinks you can do it. His critique is, if you do that, you will indeed succeed in creating a world where everyone will be motivated by interest, and that will destroy the entire world. Because once you've created that world, it will just be this endless strife of everyone seeking what is in their best interest as opposed to everyone else. It's not that that can't be done, it's precisely that it can be done. Or, put more strongly, Mencius's critique is you can construct worlds that, in fact, can operate according to all sorts of different principles. The problem isn't that you can't do that. You need to think through if you would want to do that, but of course, it also means human behavior can never, ever be thought of as a single thing. It's rather a question of how you create worlds that measure, focus, map, and create those things and that sort of behavior. Now, that's putting it very abstractly, so now let me get into a very complex set of ideas, but with lots and lots of concrete examples. The figure I will turn to next is a figure called Han Feizi. Han Feizi, who, as many of you know, is a 3rd century BCE classical Chinese thinker, one of the truly great political thinkers of all time, a figure that many people, myself included, find quite scary in terms of his normative claims, but he is a figure who very much is articulating a completely different theoretical approach, one that actually is comparable in some ways, as we'll see, to Mencius, even though they live in very different normative universes. So let me quickly lay out Han Feizi's vision. Han Feizi's notion, in a nutshell, goes along the following lines. Human beings are these incredibly, incredibly messy creatures. In articulating this, Han Feizi, as we'll see, often is the case, even though he will twist a lot of the ideas on their head, but in this sense, he is coming out of a very deep tradition that Mencius is coming out of as well, in the classical Chinese tradition, that would say, humans are messy creatures. We consist of all of these different energies, emotions, desires, all of us, and we're equally messes. And what we become over time depends on the sets of interactions we fall into, often very passively, or it can depend, if we so do, on our ability to train ourselves to actually alter these relationships and shift these trajectories. Han Feizi's teacher, Xunzi, was a master at thinking through the ways that ritual actually can function to help us train ourselves to create better forms of interaction and ultimately open up the possibilities for creating better worlds. I'll turn to Xunzi a little bit later, but Han Feizi's move in this is to say, on the contrary, what if we take the great master Xunzi's ideas that we can, through rituals, create all sorts of potentially extraordinary worlds that would inspire humans to become something not only different than they currently are, but incomparably better. And Han Feizi's move is to say, what if we take the great master's ideas and turn them on their head? What if we realize the fact, and he thinks it is a fact, that humans do, in fact, tend to fall into these interactions that can completely define their existence, into these habits and ruts that completely define them. And what if we take that as the starting point of our theory? Not to break people out of these patterns and ruts, but to keep people in them as completely as possible so that we can control them. And when he is arguing this, Hanfeize is pushing against a figure that he otherwise loves, a figure called Lord Shang. Lord Shang, as many of you know, is the prime minister of the state of Qin in the 4th century BCE that was the first, really, to create the kind of institutional system that would later come to be known as legalism. So basically, the argument in a nutshell is you should create a strong authoritarian state that will control everyone. You could do this by creating absolute laws and standards and administrative procedures that apply to everyone, aristocrat and commoner alike, exactly equally. You do this to create a pure meritocracy where people who behave as you want them to behave are promoted and moved into the bureaucracy. They will accordingly become helpful figures to the state because they will owe their position of power to the state, not to hereditary wealth they're born into. And if you create an organization like this, you can then create a state that can take control of all of the resources under its control, natural resources and human resources, and organize all of those resources for the service of the state. And for Lord Shang, what you particularly need in terms of the service of the state right then in the 4th century is building incredibly powerful mass infantry armies. So you create an incredibly effective state that will control all resources, organize those resources for war. Also, in order to have the war, you will need to organize the entire agricultural sector to give you the most possible grain to not only feed everyone in the realm, but to feed the mass infantry army. So you can organize the entire realm to do what the state wants it to do, which in this case is to build mass infantry armies to defeat the other states on the battlefield and ultimately bring to an end the warring states, period. And how, for Lord Shang, do you successfully put this into place? Well, he falls into kind of a Milton Friedman view, which in this case he's very much like Mozi. He will say, well, what is it that will really motivate humans? It's not self-interest, although he thinks that plays a role, but he thinks the much more significant one is fear. What you need to do is make people afraid. And so what you do, according to Lord Shang, is you build in incredibly vicious punishments that will apply to anyone who breaks the dictates of the state, and indeed apply to anyone in their lineage or community who would be seen as also responsible because they allowed someone in their community to do something wrong. And you make these punishments so horrific that people deeply fear the power of the state. And then Lord Shang's argument is, if this sounds horrific, don't worry, because if you make them horrific enough, within a generation, you don't even have to use punishments again, because people will just become compliant. They will see the horrible punishments around them, they will become compliant, and within a generation, he argues, people will move from deep fear to simple niceness. They will simply accept the world of the state. They will accept the fact that the state is organizing things successfully. It will not even cross their mind to not follow the dictates of the state, because the fear will be so embedded in them that they will simply come to accept the dictates of the state as simply being the way things are. Hanfeize's critique is kind of like Mencius's critique of Mozi, but again from the opposite normative criteria. Hanfeize's critique is to say, Lord Shang's vision is wonderful. Building an authoritarian state, Hanfeize loves. An authoritarian state that can take control of all of the resources under its power, he loves. What Hanfeize thinks is deadly wrong about Lord Zhang's vision is he thinks humans just don't operate this way. What happens if you build Lord Zhang's system? And he thinks you can see that empirically because the Qin largely was following this model. You build Lord Zhang's system, and according to Hanfeize, you never get past the fear. You instill incredible fear. People watch these horrible punishments, and what it creates is simply resentment. And sure, they may be compliant for a while because the state is so powerful. What else can they do? But it's simply going to breed resentment, and the more resentment that develops, over time, it will destroy any state. So how do you get people to buy into the state that Lord Zhang is calling for? What he argues is it's simply regularity. If you can make the standards and procedures so regular that everyone just, it's not even they know, it just becomes a way of life, that if they do X, they'll be rewarded. If they do Y, they'll be punished. But the punishments aren't that insane because you don't want them so insane that that becomes the focus. You want the regularity to simply be there. You want to make it so clear-cut that there's no decision-making going on. People will just come to accept that if they do X, they're rewarded. And over time, they'll just do X. And as that builds a system that slowly begins to work incredibly effectively with incredible infrastructure, everyone is well fed. Yes, there were wars, but the state is winning all the wars. It will just create the sense that, yeah, this is the proper way the world operates. And over time, people won't be resentful against some huge state. They won't even think that they're under a huge state. They will just be living their lives. According to Hanfeize, what is going on here is that humans are messy. And because we're messy, and because what we become over time depends on these patterns of interaction, what a state is doing is just creating patterns of interaction so seamless, so regular, so flawlessly functioning that this will simply become the way people live their lives. Exactly like Mencius was saying to Mozi, Hanfeize is saying to Lord Zhang, well, I love your system, unlike what Mencius, but similarly, here's how you do it by recognizing you're not mapping a world, you are creating a world. And then Hanfeize goes a step further. Let's imagine you create this world, Hanfeize argues, where everything is simply so regularized and so standardized that people will just over time come to accept it as being the way the world operates. What will happen? Well, what will happen is very intriguing. It simply will become their lives. Hanfeize will explicitly draw connections to Lao Tzu, who very famously will say, a sage generates a world where the people just come to think of it as the way the world is. And Hanfeize says, that's exactly what you're doing. No one will think they're controlled by an authoritarian state. It will just be the world. To give you a simple example from America, in America, a red light, if you're driving, means you stop. A green light, if you're driving, means you go. Lord Zhang would say the reason if you go to America, everyone follows this, even if it's in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, if there's a red light, everyone stops. Lord Zhang would say, well, that's because at some point, whenever stoplights were created in America, the state must have had such horrific punishments, it just created a world where everyone would always stop at a red light. Hanfeize would say, no. If that's what had really happened, no one would happily be stopping at a red light. Everyone would stop at a red light, seething in resentment, remembering the tales passed down through the generations of my great-grandfather who suffered this horrible punishment just because he didn't stop at a red light, and you would be seething at the American government, just waiting for the moment when you could do something to overthrow it. Hanfeize would say, on the contrary, the reason no one seethes in resentment when they see a red light, they just stop, is simply because of the regularity. You see a red light, you stop. It doesn't dawn on you that this is actually run by an incredibly powerful, effective state. It's just red. It doesn't bother you. There's no big traffic jams because everyone stops. People aren't dying running into each other. As long as it's regular, it works. And then if someone does run a red light, everyone hates that person, not the evil state, because that person is endangering people's lives. The regularity builds a world where this is simply the world you live in. And it doesn't dawn on you this is created by a state. But then Hanfeize goes the next step. If humans are messy, this is never going to work totally. It will never be the case that you can create a world so flawlessly regular that everyone will always do what you want them to do. What about them? Now, he's not worried about the people who will run a red light. Those he thinks you can catch easily enough. They'll be punished, and people won't focus on the state. They'll just think, oh yeah, the state is preventing these people who are putting others in harm. So things like running a red light does not concern Hanfeize in the slightest. What concerns Hanfeize, on the contrary, but he thinks this is a given, so your ethical theory has got to account for this. The big problem for Hanfeize is if you create a world like this, the people who are going to rise to the top aren't, although Hanfeize would love it if it was, but they are not going to be the people who just consistently did what they were told and got rewarded. The people who are totally compliant, who simply accept the system, who don't even realize the system they're living in is a constructed system, they'll never make it to the top. The people who make it to the top are the ones Hanfeize will call the wolves and the tigers. The wolves and the tigers are the ones who see through it. They're the ones who see through the fact that the state is constructing this world that's trying to build in compliance simply through regularity. They will see through it. They will manipulate the whole system for their own ends. They are the ones who end up in positions of power. They're the ones that he will call the ministers, the ones who rise up in a meritocracy, not because they're meritorious. They rise up because they see what's going on, they manipulate it for their own purposes, and they're the ones on top. And they're the ones you have to watch out for. Those are the cunning ones, the clever ones, but the ones who absolutely are going to be manipulating things, and if they manipulate too much, it will throw off the regularity of the system because people will come to realize, oh, we're really being manipulated by people on top, which of course they are, but the point is you're not supposed to allow that to be seen. And then he will develop this entire theory about the relationships of the ruler to the minister and how you try to control these wolves and tigers. Now, I won't take you through all the ins and outs of that argument, although it is very fascinating, but let me, on the contrary, pull back and note what he is doing. Note the whole point of Hanfeize's argument here is that basically the problem with Lord Zhang, and going back, the problem with Mo Zedong, is that both of them made the error of thinking they could isolate through some kind of basic simulation what made humans tick, and they wanted to organize a socio-political theory accordingly. In other words, they did what has become a very characteristic move in Euro-American theory of the past 3 centuries as well. Hanfeize's critique is to say, no, no, no. What you should do is the exact opposite. Instead of trying to whittle away, take out of consideration all of the messiness of the world and find what makes humans tick, what you want to do, on the contrary, is turn the question around. how do we humans construct worlds that people just come to live in and accept? And if we turn the question around that way, you also have to ask, where are the places where humans being messy, they will not ever become what you want them to become, and how do you deal with that? If you could imagine Hans Faetze having read Milton Friedman, I suspect what he would say to Milton Friedman is very straightforward. He would say, if Milton Friedman really believes what he is saying, and I think Milton Friedman actually did, I think Hans Faetze would say, that's his complete mistake, because he's not understanding the complexity of humans, precisely because this model is aimed at not doing so. What Hans Faetze would say is, what Milton Friedman should have been saying is he should have been doing all of this writing to fake us into believing this. Then Hans Faetze would have thought, that's great, but he clearly didn't because he didn't take the next step. And what I mean by that is the following. Hans Faetze would say, if Milton Friedman had written all of these essays and developed the theory that we have come to call neoliberalism out of an attempt to create a world that humans simply came to think and operate and be motivated by the rational self-interest, in which they came to see everything as properly operating according to simple market principles, the economy, the schools, the educational system, the political system, everything should be whittled down to a simple market. If that was Hans Faetze would say, if that was Milton Friedman's goal, great. If he knew it wasn't true, if he knew this would be a construction in which if you could somehow convince enough policymakers that you really should organize the world this way. Again, not just the market, but educational systems, everything. If you could really convince them to do this, you could create a world that largely operated on these principles. And Hans Faetze, if you were living right now, looking at this history, would say, well, that part Milton Friedman did great. He created it. He created a neoliberal world. Not because humans really are like this, but because he was able to create a world so seamlessly accepted by every single major European and American power that it became the Washington Consensus that was then imported to the rest of the world. And sure enough, everything was built out of these principles. And lo and behold, people began acting this way. But Hans Faetze's critique would be to say, the problem with Milton Friedman is he thought that was true, which means he never posed the next question, which is, if you realize you're constructing a world, you then have to think through, what are the implications of that world you're constructing? What about the fact, and it's a fact, that the people who are going to rise to the top are not going to be people simply acting according to rational self-interest. They will be the wolves and the tigers. And how does your social and political theory think all of this through? Is this the world we want to create, number one? And number two, even if it is, how do you deal with the fact that no construction will ever be perfect? And how do you build in an understanding of the problems your own theory, even if it's totally successful, will be creating? And I think Hans Faetze would say, it's clear Milton Friedman really did mean what he said because he never did those next few steps. Hans Faetze's power, in other words, is precisely that he is doing theory in a different way. Instead of simply saying, let's create a simulation, taking out the complexities of the world to isolate what makes humans tick, Hans Faetze is saying, the problem with that model is it misunderstands the way humans tick. Humans are never going to be these simple figures who can be understood through a simulation. You can never develop a socio-political theory that way if you really believe in it. If you really believe that you are actually finding the way humans tick, Hans Faetze would say, you're just being a fool. And you might succeed in creating a world, and you might succeed in creating one that's unbelievably effective, and boy, did Milton Friedman do so. The problem, however, is you're not thinking through the implications of the world you're building, because your model prevents you from doing so. Your model is based upon claiming this is simply, to use Milton Friedman's terms, positive economics. I'm simply exploring the laws of human behavior like physicists will look at the laws governing natural phenomena, period. And the model prevents you from asking what Hans Fetzer would say are the crucial questions. What is the world we are constructing? And what are the dangers of that world? And how do we deal with those dangers? That is Hans Fetzer's critique. Now, you might immediately be wondering, okay, even if this would be an effective critique of Milton Friedman, I mean, Michael, isn't it pretty clear that if there's one person in the world scarier than the world Milton Friedman created, it's the world Hans Fetzer was trying to create. So if these are our choices, why are you putting Hans Fetzer as a positive example? Here's why. Because Hans Fetzer, and this is built into the way he does sociopolitical theory, unlike the way Milton Friedman will do it, in which he has to deny that this is what he's up to, Hans Fetzer is completely honest about the world he wants to create. Would I want to live in the world Hans Fetzer is creating? Absolutely not. Do I support that kind of a vision? I absolutely do not. However, that is a values question. And if you read Hans Fetzer, he lays out his values incredibly clearly. You know exactly where he stands. He tells you exactly what kind of a world it will result in, and he works out the dangers of the very world he is trying to develop. Now, what about those other figures who, as I mentioned, Hans Fetzer is building upon but turning on their head? Well, personally, I find those figures the more powerful figures, but note, this is the same thing that they are doing. So when, to return to the figure I mentioned before, Schunze, when Schunze is making these arguments, he too is saying, we construct worlds through our actions. If you're a state, you do construct worlds that people will slowly come to simply accept as natural. Now for Schunze, that was precisely the danger. So his entire move, and in this he's very much like Mencius when he's critiquing Wadza, Schunze's entire move is to say, let us use things like ritual, which intriguingly he will talk about in an as-if form, but in the exact opposite way of Milton Friedman. The as-if points for Schunze is you create as-if rituals to break people from their normal way of being in the world, because that's precisely what you want to do. You want to prevent them from simply coming to see the world they're living in as natural. The more you can get people to realize they are living in a constructed world is the degree to which you can hopefully convince them to take that construction seriously and possibly construct better worlds. Schunze's argument is, at the past, our best moments in human history, we have seen that we are constructing worlds. One of the dangers is when we cease to see that anymore, we come to simply accept the world we're living in as being the way things are. And he wants to say, no, no, no. You use these as-if rituals to break us from that, so we will see the world as constructed. This is why, as I mentioned, Hans Fetzer is in a sense turning Schunze on his head. If people have a tendency to see the world they're living in as simply being the world, what if we take that and use it to control them? The counterposition that he's rejecting is, what if we use that insight to say, let's do everything humanly possible to break us from our tendency to see the world as natural? But note, both of them, despite the totally different normative claims, both of them would say what figures like Milton Friedman and everyone in that tradition are doing is inherently dangerous. Because from this perspective, what a Milton Friedman is doing, and he seems to even believe in what he's doing, which from their point of view would even be worse, is precisely to cut all of that out from the theory. The whole implication of all of these, the as-if simulations of a Milton Friedman, the state of nature arguments, the veil of ignorance arguments, all of these arguments, the whole move is precisely to say, let's remove humans from their daily mundane lives and create some kind of isolated simulation to see what makes individuals tick. And figures like Schunze and Hans Fetzer, despite their radical differences, would both say that's precisely what you never want to do, because that's what prevents you from asking the key questions. It is precisely in the messy, mundane lives that we create worlds, often horrible worlds, but potentially we could therefore create better worlds. The difference between a Shunzi and Hanfeizi is, do you want to encourage humans to create better worlds? Or for Hanfeizi, do you want to encourage people to accept the world they're living in as natural and use it to control them? But both accept the fact that we do create worlds in the way we live our lives. And the danger of a Milton Friedman is precisely the model means you don't even ask that question. The whole model prevents you from asking that question. And here, let me conclude by getting to my main point. Suppose we took these theories seriously. You can agree with a Shunzi or a Hanfeizi, and there are a whole series of other thinkers that, of course, we have not had time to get to. But what excites me about this body of theory is precisely the statement that if we are messy creatures, and if we fall into these types of interaction in our behavior, and if those patterns of interaction construct worlds that we tend to simply accept as being natural, then the entire body of socio-political theory coming out of that insight is based upon either helping us break out of that tendency to see the world as natural, or, and the views I would find less productive, but still they're very powerful to think with, how do we keep people within those worlds? Either way, the view is you do social and political theory by looking at humans in their mundane lives, seeing the tendencies of humans, working out the implications of that, and honestly thinking through what it means if you're going to construct one type of a world or another type of the world. There's no way you can do this type of a theory without forefronting values, and the debate therefore comes down to values. What types of worlds do we want to construct? Because we construct worlds one way or the other, and the whole point is you want it to be as self-conscious as possible in terms of the debate about what those worlds should look like. And my deep concern for all of the differences amongst all the many thinkers I've been speaking about who do the simulation models from the 17th century to the present in the Euro-American models, and globally this has popped up all over the world too, the danger of those models that we so take for granted is precisely that we do take them for granted. The danger of them is they operate by allowing us to take them for granted. They operate precisely by not allowing us to focus on those key questions, which, putting it in the scarier form, if Hanfeizi, as I mentioned, had read Milton Friedman, he would have critiqued him for the reasons I gave. Of course, he might have also said, maybe, just maybe, Milton Friedman knew all of this. Maybe all of that stuff about positive economics was simply Milton Friedman's attempts to create a world that he knew perfectly well was not real, was not true, did not match what humans are like, but his whole goal was to simply construct a world in which Hanfeizi would have said, that part would have been great. The danger is he simply never asked the next set of questions. And I would then point out, of course, if Shunzi had seen this, he would have said, yeah, that's precisely why it was so scary. It so worked because it so convinced people that was the world they were living in. It simply led to the best possible world of people in an endless competition in every sphere of their lives. And for Shunzi, that's precisely why you want to do the opposite. We live in worlds we construct, and your goal is to focus on that fact. Now, lots of different normative implications, but my takeaway is precisely that point. What about bodies of theory that focus precisely on how humans construct worlds, that focus on the values of different ways of constructing worlds, and work out the implications in terms of what that means in terms of economics, politics, social theory, ritual, religion, all of these spheres. And were we to take these thinkers from classical China seriously, it would forefront these issues in, at least what I would say, is some of the most powerful sets of understandings that I have found in any part of global theory. And ending with where I began, imagine future Economics 101 classes where this body of theory would be there as well. So you wouldn't simply be debating, is Friedman right about rational choice, or is behavioral economics the better way to understand human motivation? You're actually thinking in terms of, how do humans construct worlds? What are the types of worlds we want to construct? What are the dangers of the worlds we are trying to construct? And how do we seriously debate the implications of what we are doing? It's not just a different body of theory, it's a different way of doing theory, and one that I think the world would be much better off if we all started doing as part of our regular ways of working with mundane reality. Thank you so much. Great, so let us open this up for questions.
Do we have anybody who has a question? Perhaps let me ask you one so that guys have some time to think about something. Please. It's a very simple one. Have you ever given a talk to a business school? And if so, how did it respond? And if you haven't given it to a business school so far, what do you think would be the response?
So I haven't yet. I've tried. But I can tell you what I think the response would be. And this is why I would love to give it. I think the response would be that, well, no, Michael, the simple fact is that it has worked in the natural sciences to do these simulated experiments, and in economics it has worked. We've built an entire field based upon these simulations, and no, there's still a debate. Was Keynes right? Is Friedman right? Is behavioral economics right? But there are really only 2 or 3, depending on how one counts those, possible theories out there, and either way, it basically is it gives you a successful way to model human behavior with slightly different implications in terms of how much you tax people, how much redistribution goes on, how much regulation occurs. So with Keynes, there's of course more regulation. With Friedman, there's ideally none. With behavioral economics, there's not really regulation, but they build in what they call these incentives, where they'll say, okay, well, instead of saying to people, do you simply want to give people the choice of putting money into retirement accounts or not, you nudge them into putting them in retirement accounts. You make the default, your money goes into retirement account unless you choose to take it out. And the argument is, yeah, we're basically rational agents, but we don't think in terms of our long-term rationality. So we nudge people in the more rational way. But getting back to the question, basically all of those would accept that we as individuals are rational agents. The key is, do you leave everything to individual decision making, or does the state need to nudge you into taking into account long-term decision making? But nonetheless, by those assumptions, we've developed a successful field of economics that models human behavior. My critique, of course, would be to say, we're not modeling human behavior, we're creating that type of human behavior. We have created a world where, yes, that is what humans have become, not because we don't have tendencies to be competitive, but we have lots of tendencies. But if you create a world, if you create a world in which everything is based upon these incentives for your own personal gain, yeah, exactly like Mensch said of Moza, you can create a world, which is why economic theory seems to kind of work, because it's modeling the world that we have created. But do we want to create that kind of a world, and what are the other possibilities? So this is the debate I would love to be going on in business schools and economics departments. And it's not, because as long as the debate is simply Keynes, Friedman, or behavioral economics, that debate is precisely what cannot go on. Absolutely.
Thank you, Michael, very much. So I'm thinking with you, and the figures that you spoke about today, Hanweze, Mengzi, Xunzi, Hanweze and Xunzi, there's a very strong sense of agency here, right? A very strong sense of I, and following, at least if Hanweze is following Lao Tzu, that they're transcending they have a kind of bird's eye vision of things,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So you're talking about constructing worlds, right?
Yes.
And Han Fei's is constructing worlds, and this is what we're all involved in. So what do you do with kind of Foucault's question,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Where we're already constructed.
Absolutely.
And so even Han Fei's is in the soup.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
So is this about a kind of self-cultivation, a set of techniques or something where you're transcending this or you're dealing with this? But what if Foucault were here, how would you answer him about us already being impressed upon, right, by those very relations that are like Han Fei's is trying to regularize?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So what do you do with that? Or what would they do with that?
Absolutely. So if we took Foucault before that last period of his life, and I'll come back to the last period in a moment, but if we took before that, so think of Foucault in the 1970s, which has become the Foucault that we all tend to think of as Foucault. Foucault's model there is exactly one of saying, we live in these completely constructed worlds, but any attempt to give a normative vision of what would be a better world is simply going to create another set of dangers, which is why Foucault will come up with his argument that what we need is this, what he'll call a hyperactive pessimism, where we're simply constantly battling against forms of power, but without a normative vision about something that will be better than this, because any normative vision we come up with will again be normalizing. It will create yet another construction that will be possibly every bit as dangerous as the current one we're living in. So you're just endlessly battling and endlessly battling. Now, that is a position that I suspect both Xunzi and Han Feizi would disagree with. They would say, are we living in completely constructed worlds? Absolutely. Is Xunzi and Han Feizi themselves living in completely constructed worlds? Absolutely. Both, as you said, want to say that doesn't mean there's no agency, because the key is, if we're living in constructed worlds, can we construct different ones? And Xunzi and Han Feizi will obviously have totally different visions of what those different ones would be. Han Feizi, a much more seamless one with a much more powerful state. Xunzi, a much more open-ended one where rituals are giving you the possibilities of people constructing different, and he would say, better worlds in the future, but they absolutely want to put agency in. Now, let me say a few words, though, about that final period in Foucault's life. He dies young, so who knows where it would have gone. So I'll throw out a possibility, and maybe this is wishful thinking, but I think there's a lot of hints in his writings that this is where he's going. He seems at the end of his life to be wanting to bring agency back in. And what he suddenly turns to in those final books, like looking at the ways humans in the past, he's particularly interested in classical Greece for a while. He spends time in a Japanese Buddhist monastery, and he's interested in practices of the self that allow you to break from, I'll use words he wouldn't use, but I don't think incorrectly, constructed worlds that we are in, and opens up other possibilities. Now, again, he won't use those terms, but if you read those last books, I really do think that's where he's going. Like, he really, I think, was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the position that it's simply, again, his word, hyperactive pessimism. It's simply attacking forms of power, that he really wanted to start developing practices of the self that would open up new possibilities. Again, I'm using words he would never use. I'm sneaking in Xunzian terminology to be sure, but I absolutely think it's there. And the reason I think it's there is I do kind of suspect, we'll probably never know, but I suspect he was becoming really, he felt he had sort of entrapped himself in his own way of thinking in the 70s, and I think he was realizing, no, I'm not happy with this. And instead of simply saying, right now we need to battle against current forms of power without any vision, I think he is going through Buddhist monasteries and Greek practices of the self precisely because he wants to find these practices. And note, I don't think we're using too strong a term to say they're all ritual practices, and he seems to be seeing something in ritual that he had never allowed himself to think of before. And so I would say he seems to be moving in a direction kind of along these lines. So he was absolutely there with the absolute construction. As you said, he was not there with the agency part that you absolutely see in Shunzi and Hanfeize. But I think toward the end of his life, he was moving in that direction. And maybe I'm misreading him, but I do think that's what he's saying. And if that's the case, I do think it would be wonderful to sort of put late Foucault in conversation with some of these ritual theorists, because to some extent, I think they were pushing in very comparable directions. Yeah, please push back. Yeah, please.
I'm not pushing back. I'm just making me think. You're making me think, as you always do. That's Cornel West's critique, actually.
Yeah.
In like the late 80s.
Yes, absolutely.
That there's not enough agency here.
Exactly.
So the question then, with all these thinkers, another way to go at your project then would to go at it through a discussion of agency.
Absolutely.
Like the nature of agency, right?
Yes.
That'd be sort of going at the same sort of project, just from a different angle.
Precisely.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that is exactly right. I mean, part of what is so intriguing about both the Shunzi and Hanfeize, normative, polar opposite positions, but both absolutely are concerned with agency. I mean, Shunzi in a way that I think most of us would find more compelling, obviously, because he wants to use ritual to open up those possibilities throughout society. As he says, every man in the street has the same abilities as a sage. The problem is they're not being trained, and they're not training themselves. So how do we create a world in which that is occurring? Hanfeize, it's the exact opposite. How do we get most people to not train themselves? But both are absolutely committed, Shunzi in a positive sense, Hanfeize in a negative sense because he fears it, but both are committed to the idea that humans are capable of altering the world around them, constructing better worlds than the worlds we're born into, seeing the world as constructed and sensing how to create better forms of interaction. Both are committed to that, although they both have different views of it. And again, I do think that's where Foucault is going at that very end of his life, too. And so, yeah, I agree completely. Agency is one of the powerful views, powerful ways of thinking about this. And just sticking with your words here and then going back to people like Friedman, the chilling implication of a Friedman is he takes agency completely out, right? We're simply the simulations in his as-if models. We have no agency, and even the agency that Hanfeize would give, the wolves and the tigers who see through the simulations, those don't even exist in Milton Friedman. All of us are simply these figures who simply go for a rational self-interest. So we often think, well, neoliberalism is all about the focus on individual agency. It's almost literally the exact opposite. And yeah, I think you're exactly right. Thinking through these thinkers it's a radically different way of thinking about agency, but I agree with you, a much more productive one.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I'm not sure if I'm quite thought through with my my question, but actually Keynes and Friedman are in my textbooks when I studied economics in my college lives, and absolutely, like, these are big figures. And those years, I remember we were as students. We were so busy trying to just get a good grade for our exams. We were studying them, memorizing them, and one thing that I realized is that for those economics, for them, like they have a true belief in science and true belief in all those mathematic models. So eventually it becomes a competition who comes up with a more sexy models. Like I always regret, like I can never become a true economic because like my math is not that good. So in a sense, I feel like there is a process of institutionalization of knowledge, and so in the end, we as students, we never question the like what our teachers are doing. Like we just want to follow their path and maybe do better than what they can do, right? Propose something, but like we don't really question even the legitimacy of all these things. But on the other hand, like, would it be a dangerous world if everyone is given the agency and question the master? And I just look at what is happening nowadays, and I wonder. And also, how do you what do you think that the AI would be playing the role in this world?
Yes, wonderful set of questions. Let me begin with the first one before I turn to the second one, although it will lead directly to that second one. In terms of the first one, I honestly think it would be a better world, because what it would mean in those economics 101 classrooms is one of the initial questions would be a values question. You would be saying, what are the types of worlds we want to construct? Then you could say, the classical forms of economic theory, Friedman, Keynes, now behavioral economics, are all trying to build a certain type of a world. So you're using a very different terminology. We're not modeling them, as you said, mathematically, the way we would model the natural world through these simulations. We are constructing certain types of worlds, and are these the worlds we want to construct? And even if they are the worlds we want to construct, we must self-consciously think through the implications. And if that had been going on, if, for example, that is the way Milton Friedman had been taught in the 1970s, yeah, I think we would be living in a different world. Because I think then the question would be, number one, do we want such a world? But even for those who decided, yes, I think that's a good world, if it had been put that way, then you would also have to pose the next question of, what would be the implications? And the reason I put it that way is, note the way the arguments on the contrary went when Milton Friedman was taken to be really the form of economic and social policy for the world. The view was, this is right. He has right. Margaret Thatcher made the famous statement when she, just before Reagan did it, was introducing this throughout Britain, and her argument was, there is no alternative. This is the only way to grow an economy. Everything we've been doing, all the regulations just get in the way of what makes humans tick. There's no alternative. We must do this, and it may sound horrible, and yes, there'll be horrible social inequality, but we must do this. In the long run, the economy will grow. And Reagan typically had a sunnier way of putting it, but very similar sets of arguments. It was just, this is what humans are like. We must do this. And that was, I grew up in that world, and we were just told this all along. Like, the way to grow an economy is, this is what you must do, and in the long run, it will help everyone. And if, on the contrary, it had been taught as, this is a set of values one group of people thinks would be better, they think this would create a better world, and let's discuss it that way, even for those who agreed with it. So let's imagine that Margaret Thatchers and Ronald Reagans of the world who took it as values but just thought they were better values. At the minimum, then, they would have at least had to pose the question of, but what are the implications of building this type of a world? And we've come to know these, but this should not have been surprising to people. Like, introduce this world, you're going to create a world of unbelievable economic inequality, incredible devastation of the natural world. I mean, this should not have been a surprise. It also should not have been a surprise to see what would come next. You build a world of that level of social inequality. You build a global governance system that's all about maintaining economic efficiency, which means even democratically elected powers that try to do some kind of economic redistribution are pushed aside by the World Trade Organization. So you literally cannot do that. So you override democratically elected governments. Obviously, that is going to create, surprise, surprise, Hans Fetzer would have said this immediately, incredible resentment against this ever-growing poor people who clearly feel they have no chance in this economic system, that the whole thing is rigged for a very tiny elite group. That resentment, of course, is going to lead to incredibly strong populist movements that will call for an end to this, but an end to this in the form of creating incredibly strong forms of nationalism, to break down these global forms of trade. So all that is happening in the world should not have been a surprise. And I would say, if people were thinking of this from the beginning as a values question of constructing a world and asking, next set of questions, what happens when we construct such a world? All of what we are seeing now going on is something people would have been talking about in the 1970s too, and that would have been part of the debate. But I think you're right. There was no economics class in Europe or America where any of this was ever discussed. It was simply, does this lead to better economic models than Keynes? That was the debate. And the answer was, it does, and the world that was hence created, it was never debated as such. So this is what I would love to be happening in Economics 101 classes. Now, let me now say a few words about AI. So here's my concern about AI. AI is literally based upon the same way of doing these simulations as Milton Friedman was doing. That's how AI is built. It's all about taking things out of the messy world and doing these perfect mathematical simulations, which you can only do precisely because you isolate individuals and work out their interrelations in these mathematical models based upon something you're modeling, namely rational self-interest or whatever it is you're modeling. That's how AI works. So people talk about the dangers of AI in all sorts of ways. Intriguingly, this isn't something people are talking about, but this is absolutely something people should be talking about, because the degree to which we have created a world that we call neoliberalism based upon one set of principles, that has very much created the world we have come to know. Now AI is coming in and is doing the exact same thing. It's based upon that same vision. And look at what has happened for the past few decades, and imagine that going forward at a much greater level once you have AI coming into the picture. Now, the problem here is not AI in itself, because AI does not have to be based upon these models. You could think about all sorts of ways that we could work with these new possibilities from AI, and I think the possibilities really are extraordinary. But the danger is if you're going to build it on the same way of doing modeling that has become dominant in so much of modern theory, particularly coming out of economics, but now that's become dominant in virtually all of the disciplines of the social sciences completely. That, to me, is the real danger. And scarily, no one is even talking about that. Yeah, so thank you. Great set of questions, and I share your concern.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. Thank you very much. On this last point, I wanted to ask, at the end of your talk, you mentioned that it might have been Milton Friedman's intention that of creating the world. It's more, covert intention. If that's the case, which seems plausible, at least to me, would you not see the main difference between these two philosophical traditions? Not one that is based on a different philosophical framework, but actually one of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the key, really defining line. So that's one question. The other question is about a ritual, because you mentioned a couple of times. I want to ask you, how did the thinkers that you mentioned think of ritual as a tool to constructing world? Because ritual is also a sphere of activity that's quite separated from sort of as is reality.
Yes.
How do you use that to then sort of go beyond ritual, if you like, extend beyond it, and to construct a world that goes beyond the confined sphere of ritual? How do they think of that?
Yeah, thank you. Both great questions. I'll begin with the first, which will lead directly to the second. In terms of the first, I would like to agree with you. So let me again jump back to again, putting Han-Feize in the current world, reading Milton Friedman. I think Han-Feize, reading those essays, would say, if Milton Friedman really, really was understanding the complexities of humanity, really understood that if you actually could convince politicians to create this seamless world where everything was based upon markets, that it would create a world where people really did operate this way, I think Han-Feize would say, if Milton Friedman knew that's what he was doing, yes, it would be hypocritical, but at least it would have worked at that level. The next critique Han-Feize would have done, though, is it doesn't look like Milton Friedman was being hypocritical, because he doesn't do what you would have needed to have done next, which is to think through what are the implications of the fact that this will never be seamless, and even to the degree to which it works, it will create these incredibly dangerous effects that may take a few decades to occur, but we're living in the implications. And you will search in vain for Milton Friedman ever seeing any dangers of the system he's creating. So I think Han-Feize's critique is he wasn't being hypocritical. like it would have been better if he were being hypocritical, but then he also should have written essays sort of saying to the elites, as Hans Fetzer would read them, okay, now I need to deal with what worlds this is going to create. Now, if a Schunze had read had read Milton Friedman, Schunze would say, again, hypocritical would be horrible, but in some ways it may be even more dangerous that Milton Friedman seemed to really believe what he was saying. And it's horrible if he's hypocritical, but is it worse? I'm not sure. But it's incredibly dangerous if he really believes it. And regardless of how we read Milton Friedman, I do think most people coming out of Milton Friedman were true believers. I think they really honestly believed this is how humans work. There's the famous statement after the 2008 financial crisis when people were asking those who were in charge, saying, well, like, for the past several years, it's been obvious what the huge financial groups in America were doing. Why weren't you regulating them? And the answer was, well, I don't believe in regulation. I just thought out of rational interest, no one would do this. So clearly they would correct themselves, which means he really bought it. like he seemed to actually believe this was true. So part of the fear of doing these models is, regardless of the intent, even if people are being initially hypocritical, the danger is the models can take on a life of their own, where at least people coming later tend to see them as being true. And again, regardless of whether Milton Friedman was being hypocritical or really believed it, I do think his followers clearly did believe it, and I do think that's the danger of the model. Whereas Hans Fetzer would say, but if you're going to use models precisely hypocritical, at least think through the implications. And yeah, my concern is that mode of doing modeling prevents you from even seeing that what you're really up to, and maybe not even recognizing your own hypocrisy. Now, that's a perfect segue into the second question about ritual. So part of what I find very fascinating about ritual theory in early China is, intriguingly, they will often use the same term, as if, but they mean it in the exact opposite way of Milton Friedman. So it's not that you're creating this simulation where you pull people outside of the messy world and model this perfect world based upon one human motivation. The whole idea of these as if ritual worlds is you're constructing alternate realities. Like, you construct alternate realities where when people go into that ritual, they literally become something else relating to the rest of the things in that ritual space in a different way. So humans will become gods, gods will become humans, sons will become fathers, fathers become sons. And the whole point of that is you are creating an alternate reality that the participants going back and forth, there's no way you will think that alternate reality is the world you're living in. Like, there's no way when you walk into that as if world, you'll walk out and think, oh, I'm really the father of my father. You know perfectly well you're not. But by constructing those worlds, the idea is it creates the possibilities of seeing this world, the world outside the ritual, as being constructed, which also opens the possibility for changing it, because you literally operate in a different world, interacting with those around you in completely different ways, literally from completely different subject positions, and that opens up the possibility for changing things in this world. So it's almost a perfect opposite sense of why you construct as-if worlds. And getting back to your first question, it's the non-hypocritical version, right? like there's no way you can think that as-if ritual construction is the real world that you're also living in. Whereas the danger of Milton Friedman and that entire body of theory, the danger is, at least for people coming after him, they really believe that as-if world is the world, and that's where it becomes so dangerous. It's great set of questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's perhaps thank Professor Michael PUETTE one more time for the presentation and for the wonderful Q&A. And you all yourself too, thank you for coming.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.